Welcome to the Thought Leader series brought to you by Rare Cancers Australia. In season 1 of this series, we're piloting candid conversations with some of the brightest minds in the Australian cancer community. People with a strong vision for what things could and should look like now and into the future. In this series, you can expect real questions with real answers and fresh perspectives on what needs to change and be done to make things better for patients.
Cancer care will become much more individualised because we will use the tools of genomics and proteomics, which we now regard as largely research tools, to become part of routine patient care.
In this episode, RCA Chief Executive Richard Vines speaks to the highly acclaimed immunologist, Professor Ian Frazer. Ian and his colleague developed the world's first vaccine against cervical cancer, Gardasil. He's the founding CEO of the Translational Research Institute in Brisbane, heads a biotechnology company working on new vaccine technologies, and chairs the advisory board for the Medical Research Future Fund.
So, welcome Ian, and thank you very much for joining us on the Rare Cancers Thought Leader series. It's lovely to be here in Brisbane and to talk to you. Can I start by talking a little bit about Gardasil, which is the signature achievement, I guess, that people know you by, and I wonder how it felt when you realised that you'd got there and that you had something that was potentially a workable vaccine and a potential cure for or prevention of cervical cancer.
Yeah, look, it was a 15-year love affair with the vaccine, I think, that right back at the beginning when Jan and I came up with the technology, it looked promising, but we, of course, had no way of knowing at that time whether there would be a successful vaccine, and if there were a successful vaccine, whether it would ever be used. We didn't even really know how common the infection that causes cervical cancer turned out to be. At that time, it was still thought by many that this was a rare infection which commonly caused cancer, in which case a vaccine probably wouldn't have been the right thing to use, whereas it turned out that this was an extraordinarily common infection which rarely progressed to cancer but could be prevented from spreading through the community by a vaccine. And that's what we've ended up with. And the exciting times were when we first saw the results from the first clinical trial and the vaccine was safe and looked like it was going to work. And then, of course, when we found out from the big clinical trials that it actually was essentially 100% protective against infection, then we realised that we'd produced something useful.
Yeah, it must be an extraordinary feeling to wake up on any given morning and realise that there are hundreds of thousands of women walking around alive and healthy because of what you did. Is that a pinch yourself moment? It's dramatic.
It's still an ongoing challenge. You know, we recognise what we've managed to get with the papillomavirus vaccine, and that's certainly been very effective in the countries like Australia, United States, the United Kingdom. But they already had screening programs to help prevent cervical cancer, so the impact is there, but it's not as great as would be the case if we could really get this vaccine rolled out in the developing world effectively. And that's what I see as the challenge now, and what I put some of my effort into trying to get to have happen. We've done studies in Vanuatu, we've done studies in Bhutan. There's no problem delivering the vaccine in these countries if they're given the vaccine, but they actually have to have the vaccine in their hands to distribute it.
Right, and is hesitancy a problem? You know, one of the stories that I was talking to someone from the Philippines, and they said that there's a reluctance amongst the sort of patriarchy, if you like, because they fear that it might create promiscuity and those kind of restrictions. Do you see any of that, or is that?
Well, look, when we first launched it in Australia, there were views like that put forward. Tony Abbott famously said he wouldn't give his kids the vaccine because it might encourage promiscuity. He changed his mind about that in public fairly sharply. But yes, we will have to overcome all these barriers, the suspicion of any vaccine. I mean, during times of COVID, obviously, people are very nervous about vaccines because they know these vaccines haven't been tested as extensively as Gardasil was. Yeah. So that, yes, we have to make sure that people are fully aware of the safety of the vaccine, of the likely efficacy of it, and of the risk of cervical cancer, because quite a lot of countries, people don't really understand cancer very well at all, and they certainly don't understand that some cancers are caused by infections.
Yeah. And do you see potential for that kind of methodology, the vaccination having other application in other cancers?
Well, cervical cancer is the standout cancer, but the other cancers, that's a standout one, is the cancer of the esophagus, of the throat, which is now, at least in Australia and most developed world countries, mostly caused by papillomavirus infection. And therefore this is another cancer which should be preventable by the vaccination that we're already doing. So it's a long incubation period between catching the infection and the cancer developing. So obviously we don't yet know whether the vaccine programs will help protect that against that cancer, but it's pretty likely because the virus is clearly causative.
Yeah, of course. We're sitting here in the Translational Research Institute, which you were the founding CEO of and now chair its foundation. The translation, for our viewers, is that process by which you take a piece of science and get it from the bench to the bedside, I guess is a reasonable description. What does this institute do, and how does it facilitate that, I guess is a really interesting question.
Yeah, look, we recognise that a lot of science is slow to get translated into practice. And I think having an institute with a name that says that it's all about translation is actually quite important. But also it's very important that we sit between the university on the one side and the hospital on the other. And we kind of started with the philosophy that we wanted the research groups in here to incorporate the young researchers who are just scientists, clinician scientists like myself who work on both sides of the table, and then the clinicians who would actually be able to take the stuff into practice and advise us what works and what doesn't work, and more importantly where the needs are. Because one of the risks with science is that you can go about solving problems that don't really need a solution and then miss out on the solution that you see in front of you because you don't realize it would solve a problem. So having that interface is really important, where the scientists and the clinicians get together and talk about things regularly, and then that's basically the philosophy we've adopted here.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary building, I have to say. So it's sitting right where you want it to be, between universities and hospitals. It's an extraordinary achievement. And part of that process, you ended up being Australian of the Year, which must have been a very exciting time and a great platform to advocate for research, I should have thought.
Yes, look, it was a great opportunity. I had no idea who nominated me. I don't know how I got through the process. It was all a big surprise at the end of the day. But it was a great opportunity to go out and talk. I mean, I used that year, I took a year out effectively from running my lab and doing research, possibly to the disadvantage of my students at the time, but I thought that gave me a great chance to go out and say a few things that needed to be said in public about medical research and about a number of other issues as well. I mean, the issue of race and origin at that time was, of course, quite significant too, and I recognised that it was quite appropriate to go and talk about that with people, see what people thought. Again, it's a bit that you come along as an advocate for things and you want to just see what people are thinking and what their plans are. But the great opportunity I had was I went to talk, gave 200 public lectures in that year, and went to visit people all the way from the top end of the Northern Territory down to Tasmania, and it's really very humbling to be put in the position of being Australian of the Year, because you're treated like royalty for a year. But it's also very educational because you find out what people are really thinking.
Yeah, which is an amazing opportunity.
Got branded with the title of God's Gift to Woman by the Weekend Australian.
Is that right?
I had to live that one down. Also got the title of The Little Prick That May Save Your Life from Cosmopolitan magazine, and that was a little bit more to the point, perhaps.
That's fantastic. Oh God! In that conversation, I know that we've talked in the past about the role of patients in clinical trials and working with scientists, but how does it work in this environment? Is that a work in progress, or is it?
Well, patients are not just the target of the therapies that we're developing, they're active participants in the development of those therapies. I mean, if we come up with a solution they don't want, then we're not going to do anything useful. And we do need to hear from them what they're concerned about, what they see the problem in one light, we see it from a somewhat different light. And knowing how they feel about the problem is very important to getting the solution right. Many studies have been done on this, but it's very clear, for example, if you take a relatively common disease like type 2 diabetes, that it's not a one-size-fits-all model for treating it. Some patients will find that diet, for example, is a really useful way to go for them.
Yeah.
Others would find that extremely hard, but would quite happily take a tablet every day. Some people would happily take an injection once a day to avoid having to take tablets 6 times a day, and the other way around applies too. So really, if a patient isn't, or patients aren't involved in the discussion about developing a new treatment, you're probably going to get it wrong.
Yeah. I think that's very heartening. We have a lot of experience with patients, and a really simple example is fatigue. It's a simple word, but if you're on a trial or on a medication, and that means that you're in bed 5 days out of 7, then that's a really high impact on quality of life and needs to be considered. But it can't just be written up as, one of the side effects is one word. It's a bit more than that.
Yeah, I think that we probably underestimate the significance of some of the adverse effects that drugs have. And yes, we do need to talk with patients about it. One of the challenges, of course, is to get representative groups of patients to come and talk with us. It's, how do you pick the right people? Because they have to understand their disease a bit, otherwise it's not going to be very helpful to hear from them. Conversely, we need to be able to speak the same language as them about what we're doing, and they need to speak the same language as us about what they're perceiving, so that we can actually talk usefully together.
Yeah, and I've always thought that that's a challenge, because it does then tend to skew the patient population to perhaps patients who are more sophisticated, better educated, whereas really what you want is a broad spectrum of input, but it's just harder to get from people who are not as forthcoming and not as perhaps as articulate as others.
Yeah, it's a several-step process. You start by thinking about what you can do, and then talk with people patient groups who can give you useful feedback. And then once you know a little bit more about how a treatment works, you start thinking about how you could explain to a group of patients who perhaps don't understand quite so well what it's all about, and get information back from them. I think patient advocacy is important, but I think just talking with patients is really the important part. And that's one of the reasons why clinician scientists are clinician scientists, because we see patients in the clinic as well as doing the science in the lab.
Yeah, I think patient advocates, of which I would probably count myself as one, I kind of see us as the shop stewards of the patient community. That's our role. Our role is not to try and allow them to speak or to represent their voice, but not to actually overwhelm their voice and try to presume that we know. I don't have a lived experience as a patient. I have a lived experience as a carer, but that doesn't make me qualified to talk to you about what's important about a particular trial or whatever. We just need to remember that, I think.
Yeah, and every patient sees their disease differently. Some people will tolerate some things that other people simply wouldn't tolerate, and some people value pain-free over length of life, and others feel the other way about it, and look, I want to reach that particular goal in 5 years' time, and I put up with quite a lot of suffering in order to get there.
When we design trials and we run trials, one of the things that's happened over the since my time in involvement, we seem to be getting a better and better understanding of the complexity and diversity of cancer. And I wonder if we're being adventurous enough, for want of a better word, in the way that we design trials. It sometimes seems that we're when I look at what's going on in research, there's an element of incrementalism about it. Is there an opportunity to be braver about it and to be more adventurous with what we do?
Look, I think what's happened is that the basic science has led the way in this field. We used to think about cancer as cancer of an organ, lung or kidney or whatever. And then we got a bit more sophisticated, and the pathologists would tell us that this is a small cell cancer or a clear cell cancer, and they would divide up the kidney cancers into different categories, so that we could perhaps think about not treating all kidney cancer uniformly, because it wasn't just one disease. But what's happened now is that we've had this molecular revolution where the genomics of cancer are now included in the categorization of the cancers. So we can actually start to work on what the mechanism of driving that particular cancer is, and then you find out that they're quite diverse across a range. You know, cancers all from one organ are nevertheless quite diverse in their nature. And that in turn then leads to thinking about specific drug treatments or specific interventions to prevent the cancer, like venetoclax, for example, which is a very targeted drug, targeted a molecular abnormality, which came out of the studies on the genomics of cancer. And now also that in my own field of cancer immunology, we can now categorize tumors as to whether they have put up defenses against the immune system, and if so, what sort of defenses they've put up. And that then in turn leads to personalized targeting of that particular patient's, that particular cancer, with drugs which are designed to sort the immune problem out, if you like. If we can't get the immune system in there, we need to find ways of getting it in. If it gets in but it's switched off, then we need to be able to switch the immune system back on again, and we have drugs that can do that. And if the problem is that the person has a shortage of a particular sort of cell that might be able to fight the cancer, then we can grow those in the lab and put them into the patient, so that the therapies become focused not just around the organ and what it looked like down the microscope, but what actually is going on biologically in the cancer.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's targeting the cause, not the outcome.
Well, I think what we're really understanding now is that cancer is not one disease. Well, we always knew that, but now we're being able to subdivide it much more precisely with the tools at our disposal, and that in turn leads to more specific and less side effects from the treatments.
Yeah. And it also creates, our organisation is called Rare Cancers, and Grant MacArthur once said to me that you obviously want to rule the world because all cancers are fundamentally rare. But it does create challenges in both running trials, recruiting to trials, and commercialising or realising medicines, because we're looking at more and more precise patient populations, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge that we face actually. As we get more and more specific about what a particular cancer is caused by, you end up with a drug that will maybe only treat 1% of that cancer rather than being given to 50% of patients with the cancer. And from a commercial business point of view, of course, the drug companies find that very challenging.
Yeah.
They end up charging $1 million for a drug treatment because they need to spend that much to get back what they invested in doing the research. You know, that's the challenge, is that the research, eventually somebody pays for research, whether it's the government through basic bioscience research. Eventually a company will end up having to run a clinical trial, and if the disease that they're going to treat with that drug is a relatively rare disease, then to get the costs of all of their development work back, they have to charge a lot per patient.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, and there's kind of an opportunity in the middle of that too, which is that I sit on the board of something called OMICO, which is the Australian Genomic Cancer Medicine Centre, and they've recently been awarded a grant from the Department of Industry to run genomic testing in clinical trials, and the rationale was that that because there's so much global investment in trials, that if we get ahead of the game in genomic testing and screening, then we will attract investment and trials into the country. And it's quite a fascinating divergence from pure research.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why Australia ends up doing a lot of early stage clinical trials, is that we're seen as a very good place to do it, precisely because we have the support mechanisms to categorise things, to learn about the cancers as we go through the trials. And we also have a very good regulatory system for clinical trials here, which makes it relatively easy to do early stage clinical trials here. And those two things together make us an ideal place for doing clinical trials, and we probably just need to encourage people to take part in trials more than perhaps we do at the moment.
I totally agree. And on the subject of trials, you, amongst everything else that you do, you chair the advisory board to the Medical Research Future Fund. And a couple of questions about that. It's something that I would say is a wonderful initiative, because it creates a constant stream of funding into medical research. One of the, and this is a kind of technical question or financial question. As I understand it, there is a pool of money, 20 billion or thereabouts, and the research comes out of the returns of that money, the research funding. Does it vary if we're going through a recession or we're going through a boom time, or I'm sure it's not sitting in a fixed term deposit somewhere?
Look, the Medical Research Future Fund is part of the Future Fund, and it's a fixed amount of $20 billion. And yes, it's the income off that money that becomes available for medical research, but the government has legislated to say it will be this amount of money, $625 million a year, so that if, as at the moment, well, until last month, the return on investment wasn't all that great, then the money was still there. Okay. And in the future, obviously there will be more money coming. If they may then change that 625 million to a bigger sum, because that was the purpose of the money being put there in the first place, was to generate income. It's a substantial amount of money at 625 million. It doubles the amount nearly of money that's made available by the government for biomedical research. Just like that, in the course of 1 year, we had that huge increase. But it's very much targeted research money and focused on translational research. In other words, the Medical Research Future Fund is a bit different from the National Health and Medical Research Council's policy. They mostly, not entirely, but mostly fund people to go off and do good research. And it's the people that get the money, and then they decide how the research should go. Whereas the Medical Research Future Fund is generally more targeted. We want people to work on disease X or disease Y. And that's done through a consultation process that we have with the general public, with the researchers, with government, and that gets run every 3 years. So we set a set of strategies and priorities, and the strategy basically outlines how the money should be used as a general principle, basically on medical research targeted at some way benefiting patients. And then the priorities look for the holes, if you like, that need to be filled, where there's a potential of them being filled.
Yeah, and when we talk about research, we occasionally see articles about the uncertainty of funding and researchers' brain drain, and I've always thought you're the perfect person to ask, because if we have Australia has a brain drain, then so does Scotland, but it doesn't. I'm interested in your views on it, because it seems to me that it gets a bit hysterical at times, and it may not be what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, look, I tell my students and my postdocs they should go to the best place in the world to do the research they want to do, because that's the way that they will best advance their careers and most likely contribute usefully to the world at large. For quite a lot of things, Australia is one of the best places in the world, and we attract people because of that. There isn't a net brain drain. People move out of the country and go and get training elsewhere and usually come back. People come from overseas to get trained here, and they usually go back home from where they came from. So that there's the exchange of ideas is the important bit. People, you see it from a different perspective when you're talking to somebody who sees the whole problem in a different way, and that can help to develop things. But I think by and large, the rate limiting step for how many people get involved in medical research in any particular country is the availability of funds, mostly government funds, charitable funds as well, of course. And sometimes industry funds too, because obviously if you're in the United States, where there are many major drug companies, quite a lot of the money that they spend will be spent on medical research, and that gets added into the pool. But by and large, the rate limiting step is availability of funds.
Yeah, and other than grandchildren, what's getting you out of bed at the moment in the morning?
Yeah, well, a good question, because I'm sort of transiting from being full-time academic to being emeritus professor, so I don't get paid to do it anymore. I just come in and look after my students. But I also then have an interest in this interface between science and industry. So I'm on the board of a couple of biotech companies to try and help them with the scientific thinking behind what they're trying to develop. obviously as a board member my job is to look after the company, and I have to think of all aspects of that, but I also want to make sure that the science is right too, and that we're doing something useful. We have a very large number of small companies in Australia.
Yeah.
We don't have very many big ones, and it would be nice to have one or two really big ones that are like a CSL equivalent.
Yeah.
CSL do biomedical research, but their major interest is in plasma proteins. And I think that it would be really nice to have a Merck equivalent in Australia, a company that was really into the business of developing new therapies for common diseases and selling globally rather than just working within Australia.
Yeah, because when I look at Australian small biotechs, their business model is often to develop to a certain point to then be acquired by an American or a European multinational, which doesn't seem ideal.
Well, it's sort of partly inevitable because we're 20 million people at the corner of the earth, and we're certainly not 350 million people in the centre of things, and therefore, from the point of view of a company, they would have to see that their natural market would be Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And I'm still hoping that one day we will get a company of Merck or GSK equivalent size that's making stuff in Australia for Southeast Asia, quality product, before they come and do it for us, because that's quite likely going to be the alternate case, is that India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia all have the talent, and if they put the resources in, they could set up to do that in the other direction. We would just be the small country on the corner.
Yeah, which is not where we want to be. So I guess that leads to the final question, I guess, which is, if we're sitting here in 5 or 10 years' time, what do you hope for? What would you like to see in terms of both research in this country and cancer care in this country?
Well, research is easy. We need to continue to invest as we're doing at the moment. We just don't want to drop that particular ball at the moment, because we're I think relatively well funded to do medical research here, but we also need to embed medical research more into the health system, because that's actually where it's missing at the moment. There are isolated instances of hospitals that are doing a lot of research, but we know that the quality of the research in an institution determines the quality of the patient care in the institution, and we want good patient care as well, so that we would really want to make sure that we invest in research in the health system. The deliverers of healthcare, the professional physiotherapists, the professional pharmacists, the doctors, all involved in research. So that's one part of what I would see in 10 years' time, and I think we can achieve that. I think the other side of the coin is that cancer care will become much more individualized, because we will use the tools of genomics and proteomics, which we now regard as largely research tools, to become part of routine patient care. That will need to happen with a bit more automation, a bit reduction in cost, because at the moment these tools are expensive, and unfortunately the more you use them, the more expensive they get, because you learn more things about what you need to measure, and then that increases the cost. But we could reasonably certainly envisage that in 10 years' time, when a patient presents with cancer or with any other metabolic disorder, that we could understand the genetic component to that, the biochemical component to that, and the likely interactions that those would have with the treatments that might be given. And we're seeing that happen already. It's just slow. It's slow from when you're sitting there waiting for it to happen. But I think in 10 years there'll have been a step forward in that area, and we really will be using the tools that we have at our disposal for research at the moment as part of routine patient care. That's happened in other areas. And I mean, my discipline is cancer, and particularly cancer immunology, but if you look in cardiovascular disease, if you look in renal medicine, then we do use those tools now to better manage patients, and we will in the future for cancer as well. We'll just learn more about what works and how best to use the treatments we've got, and then if there are gaps in the treatments, we'll start to try and fill them.
Yeah, that's a great vision, and thank you very much for your time today. It's been brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been nice. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the RCA Thought Leader series. To receive each new episode in your inbox, you can subscribe to the series at rarecancers.org.au/Thought Leader series. We look forward to sharing the next candid conversation on cancer soon.